Good afternoon and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us each week to update us on the latest events in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on the current situation in Israel for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. It's been a busy week, obviously, with the war going on, but no less on the diplomatic front. We had the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, come to the region, following on from, and amongst other leading American officials of late. And the message that they're bringing publicly, let's talk publicly and privately. First of all, publicly, the message is that we have not come to demand a ceasefire. We are not holding a clock over Israel's head. It's up to Israel to decide when and how it ends this war. It's Israel's war. We are here to support Israel. We're here to provide Israel with anything that it needs for its defensive needs. But privately, there is definitely a change of tone. What we have heard behind the scenes to a certain extent, although to a certain extent also a little bit publicly, is to move from a high intensity phase to a lower intensity phase. And what does that mean? At the moment, at least according to foreign officials, Israel is engaged in a very high intensity war. It has blown up, large parts of Gaza to try and suppress Hamas, to defeat Hamas, to disrupt its governance and military operations. We've seen almost 2 million Gazans who are, internally displaced. According to Hamas figures, and we always have to take this with a large grain of salt, up to 20,000 people have been killed. They claim that something like the majority were women and children. Obviously, we know that's not true, and they don't include Hamas fighters. We don't even include those that were killed from errant missiles, and they don't, they also include terrorists and all that sort of thing. So we have to take it with a grain of salt, but these are the numbers that are doing the rounds. These are the numbers that the foreign ministries around the world are taking on board and to a certain extent accepting, even if they know that there's some mistrust there with Hamas. They think the numbers are relatively reasonable, even though Israel, by its counting, has killed at least 7,000 to 8,000 terrorists. So we're still talking about, a sort of 40% terrorist to civilian ratio, which is still much better than the 10%, which is the international sort of ratio. But the fact is that it has been high intensity, and the Americans are trying to see when Israel is going to move to what they call a lower intensity. And what that would mean is having less troops in the strip, more targeted operations, and smaller forces to deal with terrorists, to deal with the tunnels and other relevant operations, but not to have ongoing hostilities, as they may put it, all over the strip. This is what they're trying to eke out of Israel when it's going to move towards that. Obviously, the Americans, as I think President Biden said today, they're looking to, for the war to be finished as soon as possible. Now, that's not a call to finish it now, but obviously they have to at least say that they are interested that the war should end as soon as possible. We do not hear the word ceasefire, permanent ceasefire, certainly from the Americans. And interestingly enough, today was supposed to be the already delayed vote in the Security Council calling for a ceasefire. It was supposed to be yesterday, then it was supposed to be today. And they say that there's going to be a vote tomorrow. The reason it was put off is because of the American objections to the word ceasefire in the resolution. And we're talking here about Security Council resolution as opposed to the General Assembly resolution, which was already passed earlier in the week overwhelmingly, but these things always are, calling for an immediate ceasefire and not really calling on much of Hamas, and certainly not mentioning Hamas. That's something the Americans are getting tired of. The fact that all the demands are being made of Israel and nothing or very little or seldom is being made of Hamas. What we do understand is the word ceasefire will not be in this resolution. So they're trying to find language. They're trying to find that sort of a boiling point, let's say, which is the least that the countries hostile to Israel or those who want to call for a ceasefire can handle, but which is just enough for the Americans to either abstain or vote with. Obviously, that would then negate the US veto, which is very important, knowing that the Security Council resolutions are, in theory at least, obligatory, even though they are ignored regularly by many. So even if this passes, it wouldn't necessarily have any actual validity on the ground, but it would serve for quite an important diplomatic article that Israel's enemies would use. They would claim, everything that Israel's doing is ignoring the international community, ignoring Security Council resolutions. So it's very important that the language that's in there, and the Americans are working behind the scenes vociferously, trying to lower the language to a point that's acceptable. Probably not for Israel, but at least acceptable for them. If not, that they will be forced to use their veto. So the haggling continues. What we have seen also in the last week or so is really an understanding that the diplomatic clock and what they're being told, what Israel's being told by the Americans, does have an effect on the ground. And there's greater diplomatic, movement. We do see less bombing operations. We don't see the so-called ring of fire that the IAF, the Israel Air Force, has been using since the beginning of the operation as much. And when there's a need to speed up operations, we see far more of this. Now, this is important because it can have a number of factors relating not just to the diplomatic clock, to the military clock. When Israel believes it has a lot of time, then it does things a lot slower. It tries as much as possible to avoid casualties amongst the IDF and also civilian casualties, because they understand that can rouse world public opinion and obviously also the morality of the IDF. But sometimes when there is a feeling that things have to move a little bit quicker, then they have moved up operations and used far greater armaments. At the moment, it does seem that they've almost completely taken over the northern parts of the Strip, including, Gaza City and some other areas. There were still large pockets of fighting, and there still are to a certain extent today, but it's assumed that is largely that theatre of operations. There will still be soldiers, there will still be forces, but there's going to be a lot more focus on the south in the coming days. So that's also something to look out for. The other thing which is causing a lot of debate in Israel is the whole issue of hostage negotiations. There's a lot of pressure, understandably so, from the families to make sure that the issue of their loved ones who are still being held in Gaza is not off the agenda in Israel and even around the world. Hamas have come out and officially said that we will not hold any negotiations about hostages until there is a complete cessation of hostilities. In other words, the war has ended. And in fact, they've even said that, they need some rehabilitation of the Strip, et cetera, et cetera. Only then will we start negotiating on hostages. It's a delicate one, because the fact remains that Hamas do not have the pressure that they did on the first round of when there was hostage negotiations. It was felt that Sinwar felt the Israeli boot very much on his neck in terms of surrounding him. It's usually also the fact that they were running out of food and gas and all sorts of other necessities. We heard from hostages that were released during that period that their guards, the Hamas terrorists themselves, were not eating that much. They didn't seem to have much more to eat than they gave the hostages as well. So obviously they were hurting, and that forced Sinwar very much into the hostage negotiations. Because of international pressure, the aid coming into the Strip is coming in not at the same levels as during that pause, but certainly not at the lower levels that before that. So Hamas, we've seen the scenes of Hamas basically taking over aid, whether it's water, whether it's food, whether it's gasoline, whatever it is, taking it over as soon as it enters the Gaza Strip. So they are making sure that their people are very much looked after, so they do not feel the pressure. So that could account for some of Hamas's, public, let's say, reluctance to talk about hostages. Privately, it's clear that there is talk. The fact that Ismail Haniyeh, one of the leaders from abroad, has just been called to Egypt to meet with Egyptian authorities shows that there is at least some movement. But probably where there's going to be most success is not necessarily at this point for Sinwar to call for negotiations. Is the idea is to put pressure on Qatar and maybe some other elements which are close to Hamas to ensure that some level of negotiations are taking place. And that's why we saw, we saw the Israeli head of Mossad travel to Qatar a lot recently, and that didn't seem to be doing too much. But now that the Americans are back in, the Americans, as we know, who have a lot of pressure points on Qatar, and now in the picture, and there was a meeting of the leaders, the intelligence leaders of Qatar, the U.S. and Israel in Warsaw this week, which means that there's an understanding the Americans have to get a lot more involved, and they are getting a lot more involved. And it seems that the pressure at this point is more top down from Qatar to Hamas, rather than previously Hamas would tell Qatar they want to negotiate. Obviously, what level of negotiations is very important. And the fact that Hamas and Islamic Jihad released this week videos of elderly men, Israeli men held hostage in Gaza, is really a sort of hint that is where Hamas want to pick up the hostage negotiations, because as we know, last time they did not stick to the agreement where it was going to be women and children, and when they wanted to change the criteria, Israel refused and the war continued. So these videos, which were not publicly disseminated to the Israeli media, but it's clear what was in them, they forced these elderly Israeli men to say, we're running out of time, we're calling you to make a deal, our lives are in danger, etc., etc. It's clear that Hamas was also sending a message that these are the people you should be worrying about, and these are the people top of our list. On the other side, there is a debate now going on in the Security Cabinet, what level of terrorist Israel should release on that side, because as we know before, there was on the Palestinian side, it was women and children, or let's say youths under the age of 18, who had not been involved in actual murder. Yes, there was attempted murder. Yes, there was acts of terrorism, but no one who had actually been involved in murder. It seems now to make a deal because Hamas has all the cards. It does seem like Israel will have to raise the ante quite a lot and release more serious terrorists that it holds in its prisons, something which is rejected very much by other members of the Security Cabinet, like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir of the Religious Zionists and Otzma Yehudit party, respectively, who are basically saying, we shouldn't be sending, this is what Smotrich said, we shouldn't be sending the head of the Mossad to negotiate with Hamas. We should be sending him to kill the heads of Hamas. And that, received quite a rebuke from the Likud, who tried to make hay of the fact that they believe that Smotrich wasn't quick enough to, as they put it, open the tap of assistance to soldiers, to those in service and those in Miluim and the border towns that have been most affected, which then resulted in a response by Smotrich, or at least the Religious Zionist Party. Sometimes politicians in Israel like to play that game, where they don't release something under their name, but under the party's name, they're saying, well, the tap which Smotrich closed was the one that Netanyahu wanted to open to give money to the PA. The fact that Israel at the moment is not giving money, the monthly amount to the PA, which is something the Americans would certainly like to see, and Netanyahu has obviously been very much in favor of, at the moment it hasn't been handed over because Smotrich, as the finance minister, has to sign off on it, which he has refused to do up until now. So there's a real battle of narratives, politics very much coming into play. Who is the more hawkish here? But that's very much part of the game. The other major issue this week was around the Houthis, again, who not only are continuing to fire at Israel, but now they are firing on any ships which are entering the Red Sea, which they claim either is partially owned by Israel or is on its way to Israel. And this has created quite an international furor, because I think it's something like 12 to 14% of all maritime goods pass through the Red Sea. As we know, a lot of it goes into Egypt. So it's very important that remains free for navigation. And we've seen quite a few ships, I think, on a pretty much daily event being attacked. And it's obviously, exhausted the patience of the international community. A lot of companies have decided to halt operations, and that's only going to raise the costs of goods, the costs of commodities around the world, as they have to make a far longer journey, perhaps around Africa or whatever it would be. So it's something the international community certainly cannot, foresee and continue that way. There appears now to be an international coalition, 23 countries, only I believe 8 or 9 were mentioned, probably because a lot of the other nations were Muslim or Arab nations, which didn't want to be officially involved, but are certainly playing a role behind the scenes to ensure the navigation of ships. But what it will probably have to do is that we'll have to take on the Houthis in Yemen. And the leader of the Houthis came out last night with a 2-hour speech where he basically threatened America and American interests if they should be attacked. And it's clear that the Houthis do have quite an arsenal of defensive and offensive capabilities given to it by Iran. Iran itself is threatened. If America gets involved, then they will, jump in and help. So it's clear that this could be another real point of friction internationally, and it could certainly escalate. But it remains to be seen what this international force will do. Will it be of an offensive nature and actually take on the Houthis? Or will it just sit and wait? Because, as we know, there have been warships in the area before, and the Houthis were still able to conquer ships, target ships, shoot at ships, etc., etc. So we'll have to see what exactly, if the words will be moved into action. Finally, another bit of politics which is related to the war, which is something which Israelis are talking about, is there were supposed to be municipal elections. I think it was the end of November. Obviously, because of the war, they were put off. They were put off until the end of January. Now there's a big debate because they can be put off once again until the end of February, but the interior minister seems to not want to do so. Now, why is that significant? Because the interior minister, Moshe Rabel, is a member of Shas, an ultra-Orthodox party. And the Shas party, along with its ultra-Orthodox coalition part of the United Torah Judaism, most of their electorate, most of their candidates are not fighting in Gaza. They're not, in Gaza, they're not involved necessarily in the war. So they will be able to campaign, and they will also be able to get out the vote in far greater numbers. Obviously, there are certain areas where the ultra-Orthodox will come up against, let's say, for example, members of the religious Zionist community who are overwhelmingly fighting in their numbers, in ratio, in Gaza. And many of the candidates to become mayors in many municipalities around the country are in Gaza, and some of them have been there since October the 7th. They can't even think about campaigning, let alone running in the elections and having their people get out. So it's quite an absurd situation, but it seems at the moment that the Shas party are taking a hard line about it. And let's not forget that Arbel would not take this line without the leader of his party, Aryeh Deri's, permission and green light. But it's quite an absurd situation that we could have municipal elections where some of the candidates are actively fighting in Gaza, and certainly many of the people that vote for them are likewise alongside them. So it does seem, though, that there is a large majority, because obviously the ultra-Orthodox community is still a minority, even in the Knesset. So it is possible to pass a law and bypass the Interior Ministry, but the fact that the ultra-Orthodox are sticking to this line as of now certainly leaves a bad taste in the mouth of many Israelis. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you so much. So the first question in is from Barak Korkmaz asking, I would like to ask who will govern Gaza, let's say next year? Does Israel have a comprehensive plan for the future?
That's the question that every foreign interlocutor is asking of Israel. They want to know, what does the day after look like? At this moment, one thing that can be said is Israel does not have an official position. There has been talk of something akin to what is called Area B in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. As we know, Judea and Samaria split up into three areas from the Oslo Accords. Area A, which is under full Palestinian civilian and security control. Area C, which is under full Israeli civilian and security control, which is where most of the settlements are. But then you have Area B, which is under Palestinian civilian control, but Israeli security control. And that is the model that Israel is indicating will probably be moving forward, at least at first. Israel has said that there's no way that they could just walk out of Gaza on the day after. There will have to be a significant security appearance there. Whether that could also include what some Israelis are talking about is a buffer zone, maybe of 1 kilometer. Some have talked about 2 or 3 from the border, making sure that what happened on October 7th can't happen again, because Palestinian terrorists were coming right up to the border even before October 7th and clearly preparing for what they did on that fateful day. So Israel does believe it needs some buffer. That's something which the international community has alluded to, and it said that we will not allow such a thing, but that remains to be seen. As far as who will govern, well, Hamas, according to Israel at least, Hamas will not exist, or at least will not be a functioning government. So on the Palestinian arena, that only leaves really 2 other options. The first is Fatah, which is the rulers of, the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, the leading party in the PA, the party of Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority. And that is what a lot of the international community would like to see. Israel, or at least Prime Minister Netanyahu, said that that's a non-starter. He believes that the PA is just as bad as Hamas, with their pay to slay, with the incitement, with saying that they supported the pogrom on October 7th. That is not an option at this point that Israel would like to see. What it has done, interestingly enough, it has given itself a little ladder when it said that we will not allow an authority. Netanyahu is very careful to never use the word Palestinian Authority, because that would basically say that there's no chance. But he did say we will not allow an authority that incites, pays for slay, is involved in terrorism, etc., etc. So there are those who are holding out that maybe reformed PA could be more amenable to Israel. That would have to involve a lot of reform. Probably can't happen under Mahmoud Abbas. Mahmoud Abbas is also deeply unpopular. I think his favorability ratings are even in single figures in the Palestinian Authority arena. So it's unlikely that he would be able to govern. And he himself has said, I will not come in on an Israeli tank. In other words, I will come if I'm asked by the Palestinian people, not by Israel. The other alternative is to find some local, governability amongst the local population. But that's also extremely difficult when everything has been led by Hamas for many, many years, at every level, from the guy who sweeps the streets to the people who run the show, have all been Hamas. So there is no young leaders really who are waiting in the wings. That could take time to build something like that up. The other alternatives that has been mooted are, an international Arab presence, maybe international forces, but Israel does not have good experience with international forces. As we know, we have international forces pretty much on every border, even those that are now firing at us, like in the northern border with Lebanon, with Hezbollah. And to have Arab forces in Gaza and Israel having to go in to do a defensive military operation would be extremely tricky diplomatically. there is a lot of talk about various forums within the Israeli government discussing what the options are for the day after. There was a leaked report from the foreign ministry, which basically insinuated the Palestinian Authority should take over, which seemed to be against what Prime Minister Netanyahu has been suggesting publicly. So that was disavowed. Another one coming from the intelligence ministry about some sort of voluntary resettlement. But there are a few ideas out there, but at this moment in time, it's clear that Israel doesn't have anything public. It's also clear that it doesn't really have a specific strategy at this point, even privately. It is very much going with the line that let us finish this war. The most important thing is, defeating Hamas, removing it from power, and then let's see. But it's clear that Israel needs to have some serious security arrangements for the day after.
Absolutely. Thank you. So on that note, Steve Miller would like to know what area percentage is now under the IDF control of the Gaza Strip? Is central Gaza still under Hamas's control?
Well, I mean, it depends what you call under Hamas's control, because even outside of where the IDF is actively fighting, Hamas isn't as in control as it likes to think it is. I mean, today there was a lot of recordings from what's called Palestine Square in Gaza City, where the central tunnels, the central headquarters, where Sinwar, Adif, and the other Hamas leaders were basically running operations from before October 7th, including on October 7th and after. So it's clear that they're on the run. Hamas leaders are on the run. The north, which let's just say is probably around 40%, is under full Israeli control in the north, and there are pockets already of the south which Israeli forces have already entered. It'd be hard for me to give an exact number, but it's clear it's something approaching 50%. Most of the areas that they haven't entered yet are obviously in the south, but they are starting to also work and navigate areas in the south that it believes Hamas operatives are stationed in.
Thank you. Dior Strauss asks, how disgusted is the Israeli public with the behavior of Smotrich et al., if they are?
That's a good question. First of all, there's a low trust in the government, full stop. I think I saw a poll earlier, and again, I think it was 20% trust in that they want to know the trust in all the different. The IDF always gets, even after what has been considered a massive failure on October 7th, the IDF still come out with extremely high favorability and trust ratings. I think in the 80s, I think the police forces were in the 60s, the government's in the 20s. And that's also reflected in polls that we saw this week. Again, Israeli media likes to do their polls even in wartime. And we saw that Netanyahu's party is down to, I think, 15. At the moment, I think they have 33, so that's quite a slump. But Smotrich's party, according to many of the polls, doesn't even pass the threshold. So it's clear that he's not coming out of this very well. Ben Gvir, who was his partner in the last elections when they got 14, appears to be relatively holding his own. I think, according to polls, around 7. It is clear that probably in the elections, Ben Gvir did get the majority of the seats when they ran together, but still, it's an amazing, a statistic that the finance minister's party is below the electoral threshold at this moment. So it's clear that he is losing his base. People are turning away from him. But they seem to be also turning away from all the parties in the coalition, except for probably the ultra-Orthodox parties, but their public remains pretty stable regardless.
Thank you. Carrie Hillebrand would like to know, there were early reports, later denied by Jordan, that overland goods shipments from the port of Haifa through Jordan to the Gulf have greatly increased to bypass the Houthis. Do you know what the status of this arrangement is?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, there was an agreement to do that, to try and bypass the Houthis, and I believe that some transportation actually did follow that route. I don't know how much, I don't know to what level, but it's clear that it's obviously not a substitute for the sea route, because if it was, then there probably would be as much attention in this international force wouldn't be as necessary, although it's clear that the Houthi problem has to be dealt with regardless of what alternatives there are. So that's what I would say to that.
Absolutely. Thank you. So we've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you for joining us this week to update us.
Thank you.
For our viewers and listeners, please note there will be no webinar this Friday, December 22nd. And for those of you who celebrate, Merry Christmas. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.